In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a book club at Grand Meadowbrook Manor turns deadly when a sharp-witted critic collapses, poisoned by a cyanide-laced sugar cube. Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and gentle probing, unravels a web of secrets, envy, betrayal, and a stolen past. Was it the flamboyant host, guarding her investments, the nervous author, hiding a literary theft, or the brooding rival, nursing a decades-old grudge? As tensions flare and clues emerge, one truth surfaces, a single act of vengeance that shatters the calm of a cozy evening, proving that even in a village, shadows hide the darkest crimes. Chapter 1. The Invitation. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the lanes wound lazily past ivy-clad cottages and the church spire stood sentinel over gossip and tea, Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The autumn light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn Persian rug. On the table beside her, among a clutter of teacups and a well-thumbed copy of the Times, lay an envelope that had arrived with the morning post. It was of fine cream stock, edged in gold, and bore the crest of Meadowbrook Manor. Miss Marple, with her usual care, slit it open and read the contents, her pale blue eyes sharpening with interest. The letter was from Mrs. Clara Henshaw, a widow of considerable means who had taken up residence at the manor 3 years prior. Clara, known for her theatrical flair and a wardrobe that rivaled a London stage, invited Miss Marple to a book club meeting to discuss The Shadowed Veil, a new mystery novel by Mr. Julian Travers, an author whose name carried weight in literary circles. The gathering promised to be intimate, Clara herself as host, Mr. Travers attending to bask in his work's reception, Miss Evelyn Carter, a literary critic whose pen was as feared as it was respected, and Mr. Leonard Price, a rival author whose career had waned under the shadow of Travers's success. The date was set for Friday evening, and Clara's looping script urged Miss Marple to join for an evening of lively minds and spirited debate. Miss Marple set the letter down, her fingers pausing over her knitting. She had met Clara Henshaw at the village fete, where the widow's charm had been as evident as her tendency to dominate conversation. Clara's enthusiasm for books was genuine, though Miss Marple suspected her taste leaned toward the sensational. Mr. Travers, she recalled from a magazine article, was a man of meticulous habits, his novels praised for their cunning plots but whispered to lack warmth. Evelyn Carter's name was familiar too. Her reviews in the Literary Gazette were sharp enough to cut reputations to ribbons. As for Leonard Price, Miss Marple's memory stirred with village gossip. A man once hailed as a prodigy, now embittered, his name linked to a long-ago feud with Travers over a stolen idea. The combination intrigued her, not for the book itself, but for the human drama it promised. She rose, her movements spry despite her years, and crossed to the window overlooking her garden. The chrysanthemums were in full bloom, their colors bold against the fading green. Miss Marple's mind, like her garden, was orderly yet receptive to the unexpected. A book club, she mused, was a stage for egos and secrets, and Clara's choice of guests suggested more than literary discussion. Why invite two rival authors? And why Evelyn Carter, whose critiques could unsettle even the most confident writer? Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. People, she knew, revealed themselves in small ways, through a glance, a hesitation, a too careful word. A gathering like this was bound to stir something, and she was not one to miss the performance. She penned a reply, her handwriting neat and unadorned, accepting the invitation. As she sealed the envelope, her thoughts drifted to her niece, Joan, who often teased her for finding mysteries in the mundane. "You see plots everywhere, Aunt Jane," Joan had said, laughing. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Perhaps she did, but life, like a good novel, had a way of proving her right. Tucking her knitting into its bag, she resolved to observe closely at Meadowbrook Manor. The book might be fiction, but the people were real, and in St. Mary Mead, reality often held the sharpest twists. Chapter 2. The Gathering. The autumn evening draped St. Mary Mead in a soft amber glow as Miss Jane Marple's taxi wound its way up the gravel drive to Meadowbrook Manor. The manor stood grandly against the darkening sky, its Georgian facade softened by climbing roses and the flicker of gas lamps at the entrance. Miss Marple, clutching her knitting bag, stepped out, her sensible shoes crunching on the path. She paused to adjust her hat, a modest affair with a single feather, and surveyed the scene. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and from within the house came the faint hum of voices, promising an evening of more than mere literary discourse. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. She had attended many gatherings in her time, and few were as simple as they seemed. Mrs. Clara Henshaw greeted her at the door, her silk gown shimmering under the chandelier's light. Clara was a woman of 50, though her carefully arranged auburn hair and powdered cheeks suggested a defiance of time's passage. Her smile was warm, if a touch theatrical, as she clasped Miss Marple's hands. "My dear Miss Marple, how delightful you could come. We're all so eager to hear your thoughts on the shadowed veil." Her voice, rich with practiced charm, carried a hint of nervous energy, as though she were directing a play and uncertain of the cast's performance. Miss Marple, with her usual mildness, murmured a polite reply, her eyes already noting the slight tremor in Clara's fingers. The library, where the book club was to convene, was a splendid room, its oak-paneled walls lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of leather-bound tomes. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the polished floor. A mahogany table, set with a silver tea service and delicate porcelain cups, stood at the room's center, surrounded by 5 high-backed chairs upholstered in crimson velvet. The air smelled of old books and beeswax, with a faint undercurrent of Clara's lavender perfume. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and surveyed the gathering with the quiet attentiveness of a bird-watcher. Mr. Julian Travers, the author of The Shadowed Veil, stood near the fireplace, a glass of sherry in hand. He was a wiry man in his late 40s, with thinning hair and eyes that darted like a fox's, never resting long on any one face. His suit, though well-tailored, hung loosely, as if he had lost weight since its fitting. He spoke animatedly to Clara about his novel's inspiration, a tale of betrayal set in a fog-shrouded manor. But his laughter rang hollow, and Miss Marple noted how his gaze flicked toward the door, as if expecting an unwelcome arrival. She recalled the magazine profile she had read, which praised his meticulous plotting, but hinted at a reclusive nature. A man with secrets, she thought, or perhaps one who feared them. Miss Evelyn Carter, the literary critic, sat opposite, her posture rigid as she scribbled in a leather-bound notebook. She was a woman of sharp angles, high cheekbones, a pointed chin, and eyes like polished steel. Her dress, a severe gray affair, matched her reputation for cutting reviews. She glanced up occasionally, her gaze dissecting Travers with clinical precision, as if he were a specimen under her pen. Miss Marple, who had read Evelyn's column in the Literary Gazette, knew her to be a woman of formidable intellect, whose words could elevate or ruin a writer's career. Evelyn's presence, she mused, was no accident. Clara had chosen her guests with a purpose, though whether for harmony or discord remained unclear. The final guest, Mr. Leonard Price, lingered near a window, his broad shoulders hunched as he stared into the gathering dusk. He was younger than Travers, perhaps 35, with a face that might have been handsome but for the lines of discontent etched around his mouth. His suit was shabby, the cuffs frayed, and his dark hair fell untidily across his forehead. He had been a promising novelist once, Miss Marple recalled, until a public feud with Travers over a disputed manuscript had tarnished his name. Now his novels sold poorly, and his presence here seemed an odd choice for Clara's soiree. When he turned to join the group, his eyes held a smoldering resentment, particularly when they fell on Travers. Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly as she filed this observation away. Clara clapped her hands, drawing attention with the grace of a seasoned hostess. "Shall we begin? I thought we'd start with Mr. Travers telling us about the shadowed veil. It's such a thrilling tale, don't you think?" Her voice was bright, but Miss Marple caught the slight strain in it, as if she were coaxing a reluctant audience. Travers cleared his throat and launched into a description of his novel, a labyrinthine mystery involving a stolen inheritance, a cryptic letter, and a murderer hidden among a noble family. His words were polished, but his hands fidgeted with his glass, betraying unease. Miss Marple listened, her mind less on the plot than on the man delivering it. He spoke of deception with a fluency that suggested familiarity, she thought, though whether with fiction or fact, she could not yet say. Evelyn Carter interrupted, her voice crisp as frost. "Mr. Travers, your use of red herrings is clever, but don't you find it risks alienating the reader? The subplot with the governess feels derivative." Her pen tapped her notebook, each tap a small challenge. Travers flushed, his smile tightening. "Derivative? I assure you, Miss Carter, every element is original. The governess serves to deepen the mystery." His tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted how his eyes darted to Leonard Price, who had turned from the window, a faint smirk playing on his lips. The air thickened, the fire's warmth doing little to dispel the chill of unspoken grudges. Leonard spoke, his voice low and edged with bitterness. "Originality is a rare commodity, Travers. Some might say it's easily borrowed." The words hung heavy, and Clara laughed a touch too loudly to break the tension. "Oh, Leonard, you tease. Let's not stray from the book. Miss Marple, what did you think of the ending?" All eyes turned to the elderly spinster, who paused her knitting, her expression serene. "I found it most intriguing," she said mildly. "The way the truth emerges from small details, the misplaced letter, the overheard whisper, reminds me of how people reveal themselves in life. One must only watch closely." Her words were gentle, but her eyes, bright and observant, missed nothing. The discussion continued, with Clara steering it toward safer ground, character motivations, atmospheric settings. But the undercurrents persisted. Evelyn's questions grew sharper, probing Travers' research methods with an intensity that made him squirm. Leonard's contributions were sparse but barbed, each remark laced with a venom that seemed personal. Clara, ever the hostess, refilled glasses and offered biscuits, but her smiles faltered when she thought no one was looking. Miss Marple, knitting steadily, catalogued these details. Clara's nervous glance at Evelyn, Travers' avoidance of Leonard's gaze, and Leonard's clenched fist when Travers mentioned his novel's success. It was, she thought, like watching a play where the actors knew their lines, but not their true roles. As the clock struck 8, Clara suggested a break for tea. The maid, a quiet girl named Mary, entered with a fresh tray, setting it on the table with a clink of porcelain. The tea was Darjeeling, its aroma mingling with the room's bookish scent. Miss Marple declined a cup, preferring to observe as the others helped themselves. Travers poured for himself, his hands steady, but his eyes restless. Evelyn added a single sugar cube to her cup, stirring it with a silver spoon. Leonard, standing apart, took his tea black, his expression unreadable. Clara, bustling about, offered cream and lemon, her chatter filling the silence. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched the ritual, her mind alert to the smallest gestures. The way Evelyn's fingers lingered on the sugar bowl, the way Leonard's eyes followed Travers's every move. The conversation resumed, but the mood had shifted. Evelyn's voice grew more pointed, her questions now aimed at Travers's sources for the shadowed veil. "There's a certain familiarity to the plot," she said, her smile thin. "Almost as if I've read it before." Travers stiffened, his sherry glass nearly slipping from his hand. Leonard let out a low chuckle, quickly masked as a cough. Clara, sensing the discord, clapped her hands again. "Let's discuss the characters' motives. Surely we all have thoughts on the villain's choices." But before anyone could respond, Evelyn set down her cup, her face paling. She gasped, a hand flying to her throat, and then, with a terrible shudder, she collapsed onto the crimson carpet. The room froze. Clara let out a cry, her hands fluttering like startled birds. Travers dropped his glass, the sherry staining the rug. Leonard stepped forward, his face a mask of shock, though Miss Marple noted his eyes were oddly steady. She knelt beside Evelyn, her fingers seeking a pulse, but the critic's eyes stared blankly, her breath stilled. The faint scent of bitter almonds clung to the overturned cup, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. Poison, she thought, her mind already tracing the threads of the evening. Every word, every glance, every movement around the tea tray. Clara, trembling, rang for the doctor, while Travers backed away, muttering incoherently. Leonard, still by the window, said quietly, "An accident, surely." But Miss Marple, rising slowly, met his gaze, and in that moment she knew this was no accident. Inspector Craddock would arrive soon, she was certain, and the machinery of investigation would begin. But for now, as the firelight flickered and the library held its secrets, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her needles clicking once more. The book club had ended, but the real mystery had just begun, and she, with her quiet ways and sharp eyes, was already unraveling its first strands. Chapter 3. The Sudden Death. The library at Meadowbrook Manor, moments ago a stage for literary sparring, now held the stillness of a tableau struck by tragedy. Miss Evelyn Carter lay motionless on the crimson carpet, her gray dress fanned out like a fallen leaf, her notebook splayed open beside her. The fire's crackle was the only sound, save for Clara Henshaw's stifled sob as she stood frozen near the tea tray. Miss Jane Marple, kneeling by the body, felt the weight of the room's eyes upon her. Her fingers, steady despite the shock, confirmed what her instincts had already whispered. Evelyn was beyond help. The faint, acrid scent of bitter almonds lingered near the overturned teacup, a silent accusation that sharpened Miss Marple's senses. She rose, brushing her skirt, and turned to the others. Mr. Julian Travers stood rigid by the fireplace, his face ashen, the broken shards of his sherry glass glinting at his feet. Mr. Leonard Price, still near the window, watched with an unsettling calm, his hands clasped behind his back. Clara, her composure crumbling, wrung her hands, her eyes darting from Evelyn's body to the door. "Oh, this is dreadful," she cried, her voice trembling. What could have happened? She was perfectly well. Miss Marple, her expression serene but her mind racing, said nothing, her gaze lingering on the tea tray, where the silver teapot gleamed under the lamplight. Clara, rallying herself, rang the bell with a shaking hand. "We must fetch Dr. Haydock at once," she said, as if action could dispel the horror. The maid, Mary, appeared, her young face paling at the sight of Evelyn. "Run to the village, Mary," Clara instructed. "Tell Dr. Haydock it's urgent, an accident." The word hung in the air, and Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Leonard, whose lips twitched faintly, as if the term amused him. Mary nodded and hurried out, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall. Miss Marple, stepping carefully around the body, approached the tea tray, her movements unhurried but deliberate. The sugar bowl, cream jug, and teacups sat innocently, yet one cup, Evelyn's, held a secret that had ended a life. Mr. Travers, finding his voice, stammered, "It must have been her heart, some sudden attack. These things happen, don't they?" His words were hopeful, but his eyes, darting to the teacup, betrayed unease. Leonard, stepping closer, said coolly, "A heart attack? Convenient, perhaps, for some." His tone was light, but the barb was unmistakable, aimed at Travers, who flinched. Clara, flustered, interjected, "Let's not jump to conclusions." "Poor Evelyn. Oh, this is too awful." Miss Marple, her knitting bag retrieved from her chair, sat down, her needles clicking softly. She said nothing, but her mind catalogued each reaction. Clara's distress, Travers's panic, Leonard's composure. The scent of cyanide, she knew, was no accident, and its presence pointed to a hand both bold and precise. Dr. Haydock arrived swiftly, his medical bag in hand, his weathered face grim as he knelt beside Evelyn. He was a practical man, well known in Saint. Mary Mead for his blunt diagnoses and kind heart. After a brief examination, he stood, his expression darkening. "This is no heart attack," he said quietly. "There's a distinct odor of cyanide. I'll need to inform the police." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Travers muttered, "Cyanide? Impossible." Leonard, his eyes narrowing, said nothing, but Miss Marple noted how his fingers tightened briefly before relaxing. She thought of her nephew, Raymond, who once scoffed at her village parallels. Yet here, in this grand library, human nature was as raw as in any cottage. The police arrived within the hour, led by Inspector Craddock, a youngish man with a sharp mind and a respect for Miss Marple's unassuming wisdom. His men cordoned off the library, and he began questioning the group, his notebook open, his manner calm but probing. "Let's start with the sequence of events," he said, his eyes scanning the room. Clara, still shaken, recounted the evening, the discussion of the shadowed veil, the break for tea, Evelyn's sudden collapse. "I poured the tea myself," she said, her voice unsteady. "Mary brought the tray, but I served everyone. I can't imagine how this happened." Miss Marple, knitting quietly, noted the slight catch in Clara's voice, as if she were rehearsing a defense. Travers next admitted to handling the teapot, but insisted he'd only poured for himself. "I was nowhere near Evelyn's cup," he said, his voice rising. "I was discussing the book with Clara. Ask her." Clara nodded, but her eyes flickered, and Miss Marple wondered if loyalty, not certainty, prompted her agreement. Leonard, when questioned, was succinct. "I was by the window, smoking," he said, gesturing to the ashtray. "I didn't touch the tea tray after Mary brought it." His tone was even, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the faintest tightening of his jaw, a sign of control rather than indifference. Inspector Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his expression softening. "And you, Miss Marple? Did you notice anything unusual?" She paused her knitting, her face mild. "I'm afraid I'm not much for details at my age," she said, her voice gentle. "But I did notice Miss Carter took sugar with her tea. 1 cube, I believe. She was most particular about it." Craddock nodded, jotting this down, and Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind turning over the sugar bowl's contents. Cyanide, she knew, could be concealed in many forms, and Evelyn's habit of taking sugar was no secret to those who knew her. As Craddock's men searched the room, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the village chemist, Mr. Girdler, who had once mentioned cyanide's use in old photography kits, easily obtained by those with knowledge. The library offered no immediate clues, no vial, no spilled powder. But Miss Marple knew. Evidence often lay in human behavior, not objects. Clara's nervous chatter, Travers's defensive bluster, Leonard's calculated calm. Each was a thread in the tapestry of motive and opportunity. She recalled a village girl, years ago, whose jealousy had led to a poisoned well, a small act with deadly consequences. People, she thought, were predictable in their unpredictability. Craddock, concluding his initial inquiries, sealed the tea tray for analysis and instructed the group to remain in St. Mary Mead. "This is a murder investigation," he said firmly. "No one leaves until we've answers." Clara, near tears, offered rooms at the manor, but Travers and Leonard declined, each retreating to their lodgings with promises to cooperate. Miss Marple, declining a ride, chose to walk home, the night air sharp against her cheeks. As she passed the manor's roses, now cloaked in shadow, she thought of Evelyn's sharp pen, Travers's nervous glances, and Leonard's smoldering resentment. The book club had been a stage, and someone had scripted a deadly act. Her needles, tucked in her bag, would wait, but her mind was already at work, piecing together the puzzle of Meadowbrook Manor. Chapter 4. The investigation begins. The morning after Evelyn Carter's death dawned gray over St. Mary Mead, with a mist curling through the lanes like a whisper of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage parlor, her knitting needles idle for once, as she sipped a cup of Earl Grey and studied the notes she had jotted in her small, leather-bound diary. The events of the previous evening at Meadowbrook Manor played in her mind like scenes from a carefully plotted drama, each gesture and glance a clue to the poisoner's hand. The bitter almond scent of cyanide, Evelyn's crumpled form, and the strained faces of Clara, Travers, and Leonard lingered in her thoughts. She knew, as surely as she knew the rhythm of her village, that the truth lay not in grand gestures, but in the quiet details, details she intended to unravel. Inspector Craddock arrived at her cottage shortly after breakfast, his expression a mix of determination and deference. He was a man of modern methods, trained in forensic science, but he valued Miss Marple's insight into the human heart, which so often outwitted even the cleverest criminal. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chintz-covered armchair. "I hope you'll forgive the early call. I'd value your thoughts on last night." His notebook was open, his pencil poised, and Miss Marple, with a gentle smile, set her teacup down. "I'm only an old woman, Inspector," she said, her voice mild. "But I do notice things. Shall we go over the evening?" Craddock recounted his findings thus far. The coroner's preliminary report confirmed cyanide poisoning, likely ingested through Evelyn's tea, though the exact delivery method, whether in the tea itself, the sugar, or another medium, awaited laboratory analysis. The tea tray, sealed and sent for testing, was the focus of his team's efforts, but no vial or container had been found in the library. "It's a puzzle," Craddock admitted, rubbing his jaw. "Cyanide isn't something one carries casually, and yet it was administered with precision. Whoever did this knew Miss Carter's habits." Miss Marple nodded, her mind flickering to Evelyn's deliberate selection of a single sugar cube, a habit she had observed during the book club's tea break. Craddock had questioned the group again that morning at Meadowbrook Manor. Clara Henshaw, still shaken, insisted she had overseen the tea preparation, but left the tray briefly unattended while greeting Miss Marple at the door. "Mrs. Henshaw swears her maid Mary is trustworthy," Craddock said, "but we're checking her background. She's young, local, no record of trouble." Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly. She recalled Mary's pale face and trembling hands when she saw Evelyn's body, but fear could mask guilt as easily as innocence. "And Mr. Travers?" she asked, her tone deceptively casual. Travers, Craddock reported, had been nervous, his story consistent, but his manner uneasy. He admitted to pouring his own tea, but claimed he never touched Evelyn's cup. "He says he was too busy defending his novel to notice anything else," Craddock said, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "But he was near the tray when the tea was served. Opportunity, if not motive." Miss Marple's mind turned to Travers's flushed cheeks and darting eyes during Evelyn's probing questions about the shadowed veil. A man with something to hide, she thought, though whether it was murder or merely a literary sin remained unclear. Leonard Price, Craddock continued, had been the most composed of the trio. He stuck to his story. He was by the window, smoking, and didn't go near the tea tray after Mary brought it. He's a cool customer, that one. Almost too cool. Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly. Leonard's calm, she suspected, was not the ease of innocence, but the control of a man who had planned his actions carefully. She recalled his barbed remarks to Travers, each laced with a resentment that seemed to smolder beneath his surface. "Mr. Price has a history with Mr. Travers, I believe," she said softly. "A falling out some years ago?" Craddock nodded, flipping a page in his notebook. "Yes, an old literary feud. Price accused Travers of stealing ideas from an unpublished manuscript. The claim went nowhere. Price had no proof, but it ruined his reputation. He's been scraping by ever since, writing under pseudonyms." Miss Marple's needles paused. She thought of a village school teacher years ago, whose envy of a rival's success had led to petty sabotage. Envy, she knew, could fester into something far darker. "And Mrs. Henshaw?" she prompted, her eyes bright with interest. Clara, Craddock said, had been cooperative but flustered, her account of the evening punctuated by tears. She's adamant she had no reason to harm Miss Carter. They weren't close, but she admired her intellect. She did mention, though, that Miss Carter's reviews could make or break a book, and Mrs. Henshaw has invested heavily in Travers's publishing ventures. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Clara's lavish lifestyle, she recalled, was funded by shrewd investments, and a scathing review from Evelyn could have threatened her financial stake. "Money," she murmured, "is a motive as old as time, but so is pride." Craddock leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Miss Marple, you were there. Did you see anything, anything at all, that might point us in the right direction?" She tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "I saw what we all saw, Inspector, a room full of people, each with their own thoughts. Miss Carter was a woman who stirred strong feelings. Her questions were sharp, her manner challenging. Mr. Travers seemed anxious under her scrutiny, Mr. Price resentful, and Mrs. Henshaw perhaps too eager to keep the peace." She paused, her needles resuming their rhythm. "But I did notice the sugar bowl. Miss Carter took a cube, and no one else did. It's a small thing, but small things matter." Craddock jotted this down, his brow furrowing. "The sugar bowl's with the lab now. If the cyanide was in a cube, it suggests premeditation, someone who knew Miss Carter's habits." Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to a village tea party where a guest's preference for lemon had revealed a hidden grudge. Habits, she knew, were windows into motive. "And the maid, Mary?" she asked. "Did she handle the sugar?" Craddock shook his head. "Mrs. Henshaw says she filled the bowl herself, but Mary set the tray. We're looking into it." As Craddock rose to leave, Miss Marple offered a final thought. "People are like books, Inspector. The cover may be charming, but the truth lies in the pages, and sometimes in what's left unwritten." He smiled, accustomed to her cryptic wisdom, and promised to keep her informed. Alone, again, Miss Marple returned to her diary, sketching a rough timeline of the evening. Clara's greeting, Travers's nervous chatter, Leonard's brooding silence, Evelyn's pointed questions. The tea tray, she noted, had been a stage of its own, its props handled by hands that might conceal guilt. She rose and walked to her window, where the mist was lifting, revealing the neat rows of her chrysanthemums. Her mind turned to the village chemist, Mr. Girdler, who had once shown her an old photography manual mentioning cyanide's use in developing solutions. It was not a common poison, but nor was it impossible to obtain for someone determined. Clara's wealth, Travers's secrets, Leonard's bitterness, each offered a thread to tug. And then there was Mary, the maid, whose trembling hands might mean nothing or everything. Miss Marple's fingers itched to resume her knitting, but she resisted. Knowing the pattern of this, mystery was still forming. The investigation had begun, and she, with her quiet ways and sharp eyes, would follow its threads wherever they led. Chapter 5. The Rival's Grudge. The sun broke through the morning mist in St. Mary Mead, casting a pale light over Miss Jane Marple's cottage garden, where the chrysanthemums stood defiant against the autumn chill. Inside, Miss Marple sat at her small writing desk, her diary open, her neat handwriting tracing the threads of the Meadowbrook Manor mystery. Evelyn Carter's death by cyanide, the strained faces of Clara Henshaw, Julian Travers, and Leonard Price, and the unassuming tea tray all lingered in her mind. She had seen many a village quarrel turn bitter, but this was no mere spat. It was murder, calculated and cold. Her thoughts turned to Leonard Price, whose calm demeanor and barbed remarks at the book club suggested a resentment deeper than literary rivalry. To understand him, she decided, was to tug at a knot that might unravel the truth. Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, and set out for Meadowbrook Manor. Clara had invited her for morning tea, an opportunity to observe the widow in her own domain and perhaps glean more about Leonard's past. The walk through the village was brisk, the lanes alive with the chatter of shopkeepers and the clatter of milk bottles. Miss Marple nodded politely to Mrs. Bantry, who was pruning her roses and eager for gossip about the manor's tragedy. "Such a shock, Miss Marple," she called. "Do you think it was one of them?" Miss Marple smiled, her reply vague. "People are so unpredictable, aren't they?" she said, and continued on, her mind already elsewhere. At Meadowbrook Manor, Clara greeted her with a warmth that seemed slightly forced, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. The drawing room, less grand than the library but no less elegant, was adorned with gilt-framed mirrors and a vase of hothouse lilies. A silver tray bore a teapot, cups, and a plate of scones, but Miss Marple noted Clara's hesitation as she poured, as if the act recalled the fatal tea of the previous evening. "I can't stop thinking about poor Evelyn," Clara said, her voice trembling. "To think it happened here, under my roof." Miss Marple murmured sympathy, her eyes noting the slight tremor in Clara's hand. Grief, she thought, or perhaps guilt. As they sipped tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation gently toward Leonard Price. "Mr. Price seemed rather quiet last night," she remarked, her tone mild. "I understand he and Mr. Travers have a history." Clara's cup paused midway to her lips, and she set it down with care. "Oh, yes, a dreadful business," she said, her voice lowering as if the walls might overhear. "It was years ago, before I came to St. Mary Mead. Leonard was quite the rising star then, you know. A novel of his, The Crimson Tide, was much admired, but he claimed Julian Travers stole ideas from an unpublished manuscript of his for The Gilded Mask. There was a public row, articles, accusations, but Leonard couldn't prove it. The publishers sided with Julian, and Leonard's career never recovered." Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked rhythmically. She recalled a village dressmaker whose designs were copied by a rival, the bitterness festering for years. "How sad," she said softly. "And you invited him to the book club despite this?" Clara flushed, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. "I thought it might mend things. Leonard's been so withdrawn, living in that shabby cottage by the mill. I hoped discussing Julian's book might bring some closure. Silly of me, perhaps." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and searching, met Clara's. "Not silly," she said kindly. "But people carry old wounds differently, don't they?" Clara nodded, her gaze distant. "Leonard was reluctant to come, but I persuaded him. He said he'd rather not face Julian, but he arrived early, before the others. He even helped Mary arrange the chairs." Miss Marple's needles paused. Early, she thought, and near the tea tray before the others arrived. "How thoughtful of him," she said, her voice neutral. "And did he seem agitated?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really. He was quiet, but that's Leonard. He keeps to himself, always has." Miss Marple smiled, filing this away. Leonard's early arrival suggested opportunity, and his calm during Evelyn's collapse suggested a man prepared for chaos. After tea, Miss Marple excused herself, claiming a need to stretch her legs. She wandered toward the library, where Inspector Craddock's men had left yellow tape across the door. Peering through the glass, she saw the room unchanged, the tea tray gone, but the chairs still arranged in their semicircle. She thought of Leonard by the window, his back to the group, and wondered what he had seen or done before the others arrived. Returning to Clara, she asked with apparent innocence about the sugar bowl. Miss Carter was particular about her tea, wasn't she? Always one sugar cube, I noticed. Clara blinked, surprised. Why, yes, I suppose so. She mentioned it once. Said sugar softened the Darjeeling's bite. I never thought much of it. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her diary open once more. Leonard Price's grudge against Travers was no secret, but his composure during the tragedy intrigued her. She recalled a village lad, wronged by a neighbor who had waited years for revenge, his anger cold and patient. Leonard, she suspected, was such a man, his bitterness not a flare, but a slow burn. His early arrival at the manor, his proximity to the tea tray, and his history with Travers painted a picture, but it was incomplete. Why Evelyn, she wondered. Had her sharp questions about the shadowed veil threatened to expose something Leonard wanted hidden? Or was she merely a means to an end, a way to strike at Travers? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the cyanide itself. Mr. Girdler, the chemist, had once shown her an old bottle of potassium cyanide, kept under lock for safety. Used in photography years ago, he'd said. Nasty stuff, but not hard to come by if you know where to look. Leonard, with his reclusive habits, might have such knowledge. She made a mental note to ask Craddock about Leonard's cottage. Perhaps a search would reveal more than his words. For now, she closed her diary, her mind alight with possibilities. The rival's grudge was a thread, strong and taut, but it was not the only one. Clara's investments, Travers's secrets, and even Mary's trembling hands wove into the pattern, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, would follow each until the truth emerged. Chapter 6. The Author's Secret. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a muted glow on the cobblestone path as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village's modest inn, the Blue Boar. Her mission was to call on Mr. Julian Travers, the celebrated author whose novel The Shadowed Veil had been the centerpiece of the fatal book club at Meadowbrook Manor. Miss Marple's knitting bag swung gently at her side, a comforting weight, though her mind was far from the soft wool within. Evelyn Carter's death by cyanide, the tense undercurrents among the guests, and the lingering question of motive occupied her thoughts. Travers's nervous demeanor during the book club, particularly under Evelyn's sharp scrutiny, suggested a man with more to hide than a poorly reviewed plot. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through facades, intended to uncover what lay beneath his polished exterior. The Blue Boar was a quaint establishment, its low ceilings and dark beams exuding a warmth that contrasted with the chill of the day. Travers had taken a room there for his stay in St. Mary Mead, a choice Miss Marple found curious for a man of his means. She found him in the inn's small parlor, seated at a corner table with a cup of weak coffee and a stack of papers, his pen scratching furiously. He looked up as she approached, his wiry frame tensing, his eyes flickering with unease. "Miss Marple," he said, rising hastily, his smile strained. "What a surprise. Please join me." His courtesy was impeccable, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he gestured to a chair. She settled opposite him, her knitting bag at her feet, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mr. Travers," she said, her voice gentle. "I was passing and thought to offer my condolences for poor Miss Carter. Such a shock, wasn't it?" Travers nodded, his fingers tightening around his pen. "Dreadful," he murmured. "I can't fathom it. She was formidable, but to die like that." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the way his gaze darted to the window, as if seeking escape. She recalled a village curate, years ago, whose nervous tics had betrayed a guilty conscience over a minor theft. Travers, she thought, was no curate, but his unease was telling. She drew out her knitting, the needles clicking softly as she steered the conversation to the book club. "Miss Carter was quite taken with the shadowed veil," she remarked, her tone conversational. "Though she did ask some pointed questions about your sources, she seemed to think parts of it familiar." Travers' face paled, and he set his pen down with care. "Familiar?" he said, his voice sharp. "She was mistaken. My work is entirely my own. Critics like her often see shadows where there are none." His defensiveness was swift, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting his with a mild curiosity that belied her probing intent. "Oh, I'm sure," she said soothingly. "But she was a perceptive woman, wasn't she? I recall her mentioning something about your research methods, almost as if she'd uncovered a secret." Travers shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming on the table. "Evelyn Carter made a career of stirring trouble," he said, a bitter edge to his voice. "She was preparing a review of my book, hinted it would be scathing, said she'd found inconsistencies in my sources, something about an old manuscript I'd referenced. Nonsense, of course." He forced a laugh, but it rang hollow, and Miss Marple noted the beads of sweat on his brow despite the cool room. She tilted her head, her expression one of innocent interest. "An old manuscript? How intriguing. I suppose writing a novel must involve so much research, old letters, diaries, that sort of thing." Travers nodded, seizing the change of topic. "Exactly. I spend months in archives, piecing together details. The shadowed veil draws on historical betrayals, nothing anyone could claim as their own." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in his eyes, as if he'd said too much. She thought of Leonard Price's accusation, years ago, that Travers had plagiarized his work. Could Evelyn have stumbled upon evidence of that old theft? And if so, was it worth killing to keep buried? Changing tack, she asked about the book club itself. "You seemed a bit unsettled that evening," she said gently. "I suppose Miss Carter's questions were rather trying." Travers's jaw tightened. "She was relentless," he admitted. "Kept pressing me about my inspirations, as if I'd cribbed from someone else. It was insulting." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Between you and me, Miss Marple, I was glad when the tea break came. I needed a moment to collect myself." Miss Marple nodded, her mind flashing to the tea tray, where Travers had poured his own cup, his hands near the sugar bowl. "And you poured your tea?" she said, almost absently. "Did you notice Miss Carter's habits? She was particular about her sugar, wasn't she?" Travers blinked, caught off guard. "Sugar? I suppose so. I didn't pay much attention. I was focused on Clara, Mrs. Henshaw, I mean. She was asking about my next book." His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind noting the haste in his reply. She recalled a village girl who had lied about a stolen brooch, her story unraveling under gentle questioning. Travers, she thought, was weaving a similar web, but whether of guilt or mere embarrassment, she could not yet tell. As their conversation drew to a close, Travers excused himself, claiming a deadline. Miss Marple watched him gather his papers, his movements jerky, and thanked him for his time. Back in the village, she paused at the post office to chat with Miss Hartnell, whose knack for gossip rivaled her own for observation. "That Mr. Travers," Miss Hartnell said, leaning over the counter, "always so secretive, shutting himself up at the inn. They say he's had letters from London, publishers perhaps, or something else." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Evelyn's notebook, which Craddock had mentioned contained cryptic notes about Travers' work. Had she uncovered a truth that threatened more than his reputation? Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her diary open. She jotted down Travers' words, his nervous tics, and his mention of an old manuscript. The plagiarism accusation from Leonard Price loomed large, and she wondered if Evelyn's probing had struck too close to the truth. Travers' career depended on his originality. A scandal could ruin him. She thought of a village poet, once lauded, whose borrowed verses had led to disgrace. Pride, she knew, could drive a man to desperate acts. Yet Travers' fear seemed raw, not calculated, unlike Leonard's cool reserve. Was he a victim of his own secrets, or had he silenced Evelyn to protect them? Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the cyanide, its bitter almond scent a clue in itself. Travers, with his reclusive habits, might have access to such a poison, perhaps through literary research or darker means. She resolved to ask Inspector Craddock about Travers's movements before the book club and whether his room at the Blue Boar held any clues. For now, she closed her diary, her mind alight with the image of Travers's trembling hands and Evelyn's fallen cup. The author's secret was a thread, fragile but taut, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would pull it gently until the pattern of the crime emerged. Chapter 7. The Host's Facade. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the lawns of Meadowbrook Manor as Miss Jane Marple approached its grand entrance, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm. The air was crisp, scented with damp earth and the faint sweetness of fading roses. Clara Henshaw had invited her for lunch, a gesture framed as neighborly concern but tinged, Miss Marple suspected, with a need to unburden herself after Evelyn Carter's shocking death. The cyanide-laced tea, the strained faces of Julian Travers and Leonard Price, and the unanswered question of motive swirled in Miss Marple's mind. Clara, with her theatrical charm and nervous glances, was a figure of interest, not merely the gracious host, but a woman whose actions might conceal a deeper purpose. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, intended to probe beneath the widow's polished surface. Clara greeted her in the hall, her silk dress a soft green that complemented the manor's opulent decor. Her smile was warm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of strain, like a performer uncertain of her lines. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, leading the way to the dining room. "I've been so dreadfully shaken, I scarcely know what to do with myself." Her voice carried a practiced lilt, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her lips, a sign of effort to maintain composure. The dining room was a vision of elegance, with a polished oak table set for two, silver candelabra gleaming, and a window overlooking the manicured gardens. A simple lunch of cold chicken, salad, and fresh bread was served by Mary. the maid, whose quiet movements and downcast eyes Miss Marple observed with interest. As they ate, Clara spoke of the book club, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I keep replaying that awful moment," she said, her fork pausing over her plate. "Evelyn was so lively, so sharp. Then, to see her collapse like that." She shuddered, her hand brushing a stray curl from her forehead. Miss Marple murmured sympathy, her eyes gentle but watchful. "It must be a heavy burden, hosting such an evening," she said. "You chose such an interesting group. Miss Carter, Mr. Travers, Mr. Price. Quite a mix of temperaments." Clara's smile faltered, and she reached for her water glass, her fingers lingering on its stem. "I suppose so," she said. "I thought it would make for lively discussion. I never imagined—" Miss Marple's knitting, drawn from her bag, provided a soft counterpoint to the conversation, the needles clicking like a metronome. "Miss Carter was a formidable woman," she remarked, her tone conversational. "Her reviews carried such weight. I imagine her opinions could have consequences." Clara nodded, her expression tightening. "Oh, yes. Evelyn was brilliant but ruthless. I admired her mind, but she could be abrasive. She didn't spare feelings, not even mine." Her laugh was brittle, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the fleeting glance toward the window, as if Clara sought an escape from her own words. Gently, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Clara's connection to the literary world. "You're quite the patron of the arts, aren't you?" she said, her voice mild. "I heard you've supported Mr. Travers's work. Quite an investment." Clara flushed, her fingers twisting a napkin. "Well, yes, I've backed a few of Julian's projects. His novels sell wonderfully, you know. It's a sound investment, and I do love books." Her words were quick, almost defensive, and Miss Marple recalled a village widow who had poured her savings into a failing venture, her pride masking her fear. "And a poor review from Miss Carter," Miss Marple said softly, "might have been quite a blow, financially speaking." Clara's eyes widened, and she set her napkin down with care. "I suppose it could have been," she admitted. "Evelyn hinted her review of The Shadowed Veil would be critical. She said something about authenticity, or lack of it. But I had no reason to harm her. I wanted the book club to be a success, to bring people together." Her voice rose, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in it, as if Clara were convincing herself as much as her guest. She thought of a village fete where a hostess's eagerness to please had hidden a deeper agenda. Clara's hospitality, she suspected, was not without purpose. Changing tack, Miss Marple asked about the tea tray, her tone as innocent as if she were discussing the weather. "You managed everything so beautifully that evening," she said. "The tea, the biscuits, such attention to detail. Did you prepare the tray yourself?" Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing the tablecloth. "I oversaw it, of course. Mary brought the tray from the kitchen, but I arranged the cups and filled the sugar bowl. It's a habit of mine, liking things just so." Miss Marple nodded, her mind flashing to the sugar bowl, where Evelyn's single cube had carried death. "And Mary," she said, "she's such a quiet girl." Was she in the room when the tea was served? Clara frowned, as if the question puzzled her. "Mary? No, she left after bringing the tray. I sent her to fetch more biscuits, I think. She was terribly upset when she saw poor Evelyn." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind noting the maid's absence during the critical moment. Mary's trembling hands, she recalled, could stem from shock or from knowledge. "How thoughtful of you to manage it all," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "It must be difficult, with such a tragedy under your roof." Clara's eyes glistened, and she dabbed them with her napkin. "It's unbearable," she whispered. "I keep thinking I could have done something." After lunch, Clara offered a tour of the manor's gardens, but Miss Marple, citing a chill in the air, declined and took her leave. As she walked back to her cottage, the village bustling quietly around her, she turned over Clara's words. The widow's distress seemed genuine, yet her insistence on her role in the tea preparation was curiously emphatic, as if she feared blame, or sought to deflect it. Miss Marple thought of a village seamstress who had over-explained a torn dress, her chatter masking a deliberate act. Clara's investment in Travers' work, she mused, gave her a stake in his success, and Evelyn's threatened review could have jeopardized that. But was it enough for murder? At her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her diary open. She jotted down Clara's hesitations, her mention of the sugar bowl, and her absence of Mary during the tea service. The cyanide, she knew, required opportunity and intent, and Clara's access to the tray made her a figure of interest. Yet her nervous energy suggested fear rather than calculation, unlike Leonard's cool reserve or Travers's jittery defensiveness. Miss Marple recalled a village scandal where a benefactor's generosity had hidden a desire for control. Clara's role as host, she suspected, was more than it seemed, a facade that might crack under closer scrutiny. She resolved to speak with Inspector Craddock about the manor's staff, particularly Mary, whose absence at the critical moment was a gap in the narrative. The sugar bowl, too, warranted further inquiry. Had Clara truly filled it alone, or had another hand tampered with its contents? As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind weaving the threads of motive and opportunity. Clara's facade, like a well-worn mask, concealed something, whether guilt, fear, or mere complicity. Miss Marple would discover in time. Chapter 8. The Hidden Clue. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in a crisp autumn clarity, as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Meadowbrook Manor. The events of Evelyn Carter's poisoning, now 2 days past, hung over the village like a persistent fog, and Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of observations. Clara Henshaw's nervous hospitality, Julian Travers's defensive unease, Leonard Price's smoldering resentment, and the quiet maid Mary's trembling hands. The cyanide, delivered with such deadly precision, pointed to a calculated mind, and Miss Marple was determined to find the thread that would unravel the mystery. Inspector Craddock had agreed to let her revisit the library, under supervision, and she hoped the scene of the crime might yield a clue overlooked in the initial chaos. The manor's gravel drive crunched under her sensible shoes as she approached, her knitting bag a familiar companion. Clara was absent, attending to village errands, but a young constable, Jenkins, met her at the door, his manner polite but faintly puzzled. "Inspector says you're to have a look, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Not sure what you'll find. The lads went over the place thoroughly." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Sometimes, Constable, it's the smallest things that matter most. Like a dropped stitch in a sweater. It seems nothing, but it can unravel the whole." Jenkins, unaccustomed to such analogies, nodded uncertainly and led her to the library. The room was as she remembered it, though the air now held a stale chill, the fire long extinguished. The oak shelves loomed, their books silent witnesses to the tragedy. The crimson carpet bore faint stains where Evelyn's teacup had spilled, and the mahogany table stood bare, the tea tray confiscated for analysis. Miss Marple's gaze swept the scene, her mind reconstructing the evening. Clara's bustling hospitality, Travers's nervous chatter, Leonard's brooding presence by the window, and Evelyn's sharp questions, cut short by her collapse. The sugar bowl, she recalled, had been Evelyn's undoing, and its contents were now with the police laboratory. But something nagged at her, a detail, small and overlooked, like a pebble in a shoe. She approached the table, her movements slow and deliberate, and asked Jenkins to step aside. "I shan't touch anything," she assured him, her voice mild. "I only wish to see." Her eyes scanned the polished surface, then drifted to the floor, where the carpet's edge met the table's legs. There, caught in a fold of fabric, was a tiny object, glinting faintly in the light. She bent closer, her heart quickening. It was a sugar cube, its edges slightly irregular, one corner discolored with a faint greenish tinge. "Constable," she said, her tone calm but firm, "would you be so kind as to fetch a small envelope? I believe we've found something." Jenkins, startled, retrieved an evidence envelope from his satchel, and with a pair of tweezers, he carefully lifted the cube, sealing it inside. "Blimey, Miss Marple," he said. "How'd you spot that?" "We swept the place." She smiled, her needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag. "One learns to look where others don't, Constable. A sugar cube is such a common thing, isn't it? But this one, it's not quite right." Jenkins, still marveling, promised to deliver it to Inspector Craddock at once. Miss Marple, satisfied, took a final look around the library, her mind turning to the cube's significance. Cyanide, she knew, could be dissolved in sugar syrup, molded into a cube, and left to dry, a method both simple and sinister. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her diary open, her pen tracing the morning's discovery. She recalled a conversation with Mr. Girdler, the village chemist, who had once described cyanide's solubility in liquid, its use in old industrial processes. "A drop of syrup, a careful hand," he'd said, "and you'd never know until it was too late." The discolored cube, she suspected, was the key. A premeditated act, placed in the bowl for Evelyn's particular habit. But whose hand had done it? Clara, who filled the bowl? Travers, who poured his tea nearby? Leonard, who arrived early? Or even Mary, whose absence during the tea service was oddly convenient? She telephoned Inspector Craddock, her voice as unassuming as ever. "I do hope you'll test that sugar cube promptly, Inspector," she said. "It may tell us more than we expect." Craddock, accustomed to her instincts, assured her it would be rushed to the laboratory. "Anything else, Miss Marple?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Only this. Whoever placed that cube knew Miss Carter's habits. It's a personal act, don't you think?" Craddock agreed, promising to re-question the suspects about their knowledge of Evelyn's tea preferences. Alone. Again, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the book club's dynamics. Clara's eagerness to host, Travers's fear of exposure, Leonard's buried grudge. All pointed to motives, but the cube suggested a plan formed before the evening began. She recalled a village baker whose tampered loaves had caused a scandal, the act driven by a long-nursed slight. Premeditation, she knew, required not just opportunity, but intent, and the cube's presence narrowed the field. Clara's access to the sugar bowl was undeniable, yet her distress seemed too raw for guile. Travers's nerves suggested fear, not cunning. Leonard's early arrival and cool demeanor, however, hinted at a mind capable of such precision. Miss Marple's needles clicked as she considered Mary, the maid. Her absence during the tea service, her trembling hands afterward. Could they mask complicity? A young girl, perhaps swayed by loyalty or coercion, might have been an unwitting tool. Miss Marple thought of a village lass who had once hidden a stolen ring for a suitor. Her innocence exploited. She resolved to ask Craddock about Mary's background, her ties to the manor, her knowledge of the guests. For now, the sugar cube was a hidden clue, a tiny spark in the darkness of the crime, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would follow its light to the truth. Chapter 9. The motive unraveled. The soft glow of lamplight filled Miss Jane Marple's cottage parlor as the afternoon waned in St. Mary Mead, the village settling into its quiet evening rhythm. Outside, the chrysanthemums stood sentinel in her garden, their colors muted by the gathering dusk. Inside, Miss Marple sat with her diary open, her neat handwriting cataloging the threads of Evelyn Carter's murder, the cyanide-laced sugar cube, Clara Henshaw's strained hospitality, Julian Travers's nervous secrets, and Leonard Price's chilling composure. The discovery of the tampered sugar cube in the library had sharpened her focus, pointing to a calculated act that required both access and intent. Leonard, with his early arrival at Meadowbrook Manor and his long simmering grudge against Travers, loomed large in her thoughts. To unravel his motive, she decided, was to edge closer to the truth, and so she resolved to invite him for tea, a setting, she knew, where tongues often loosened under gentle probing. She sent a note to Leonard's cottage by the mill, couched in her usual courteous tone, inviting him to discuss the shadowed veil and share his thoughts on the tragic evening. His reply came swiftly, agreeing to visit that evening, and Miss Marple prepared her parlor with care. A tray of tea, a plate of shortbread, and her knitting bag at the ready. The fire crackled warmly as Leonard arrived, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his dark eyes wary but polite. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "this is kind of you, though I'm not sure what more I can say about that dreadful night." His smile was thin, and Miss Marple noted the careful way he carried himself, like a man accustomed to guarding his thoughts. They settled by the fire, and Miss Marple poured tea, her movements deliberate, her eyes missing nothing. Leonard's hands, she observed, were steady as he took his cup, but his fingers lingered on the saucer, as if anchoring himself. "I was so sorry about Miss Carter," she began, her tone soft. "She had such a keen mind, didn't she? Her questions about Mr. Travers' book were quite pointed." Leonard's lips twitched, a flicker of amusement or disdain. "Evelyn was never subtle," he said. "She enjoyed rattling cages, especially Travers. He didn't take it well." His tone was even, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of satisfaction, like a village lad who'd seen a rival humbled. She drew out her knitting, the needles clicking rhythmically as she steered the conversation. "You and Mr. Travers have a history, I believe," she said, her voice as mild as if discussing the weather. "Something about a manuscript years ago?" Leonard's eyes narrowed, and he set his cup down with a faint clink. "You've heard the gossip, then," he said, his voice tightening. "Yes, Travers stole ideas from my unpublished work for the Gilded Mask. I couldn't prove it. No one believed me. It cost me my career, while he basked in glory." His words were bitter, but his composure held. and Miss Marple thought of a village blacksmith whose quiet rage had smoldered for years over a lost apprenticeship. "I'm sure that was terribly unfair," she said, her sympathy genuine but her eyes sharp. "Miss Carter, I understand, was looking into Mr. Travers's sources. Did she ever speak to you about it?" Leonard hesitated, his fingers drumming briefly on his knee. "She did, a few weeks ago," he admitted. "Came to my cottage, all business, saying she'd found something odd about the shadowed veil. Hinted it echoed my old manuscript. Details only I'd know. She wanted me to collaborate on an article, expose Travers for what he is." His voice grew taut, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the revelation. Evelyn, she thought, had held a weapon, a truth that could revive Leonard's name or destroy Travers. "And you declined?" she asked, her tone gently curious. Leonard's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, his eyes fixed on the fire. "I did. Pride, I suppose. I didn't want my comeback to be some sensational exposé tied to her pen. I told her to go ahead without me. She said she'd reveal it after the book club." His words were measured, but Miss Marple noted the clench of his fists, a fleeting sign of tension. She recalled a village girl who had refused a suitor's help, only to act in secret to reclaim her honor. Had Leonard's refusal masked a darker plan? Changing tack, she mentioned the tea tray, her voice as innocent as a summer breeze. "Miss Carter was so particular about her tea, wasn't she? Always one sugar cube, I noticed." Leonard's gaze flickered, but he nodded. "She made a point of it, yes, said it was her only indulgence." He shrugged, as if it were trivial, but Miss Marple's mind turned to the discolored sugar cube, its greenish tinge a silent accusation. Leonard's early arrival at the manor, Clara had mentioned, gave him access to the tray before the others arrived. Had he known Evelyn's habit and used it to silence her before she could expose Travers? As the fire dwindled, Miss Marple offered more tea, her questions growing softer, more circuitous. "You arrived early that evening, didn't you? So kind to help Mrs. Henshaw with the chairs." Leonard's eyes met hers, a flash of wariness quickly masked. "I did," he said. "Clara asked me to come early. Thought it might ease things with Travers. I just moved a few chairs, nothing more." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple noted the slight stiffening of his shoulders, as if he sensed a trap. She smiled, her needles clicking steadily. "Such small things matter, don't they?" she said, "like a sugar cube in a bowl." Leonard left soon after, his manner polite but guarded, and Miss Marple sat alone, her diary open. She jotted down his words, his clenched fists, and his admission of Evelyn's offer. The motive was clear. Evelyn's knowledge threatened to expose Travers's plagiarism, a truth that could have restored Leonard's reputation, but also stirred his old wounds. Had he poisoned her to prevent the revelation or to punish Travers indirectly? She thought of a village farmer who had sabotaged a rival's crops, his anger cloaked in calm. Leonard's composure, she suspected, was a similar mask, hiding a calculated act. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, her voice as unassuming as ever. "I've had a chat with Mr. Price," she said. "He mentioned Miss Carter's interest in an old manuscript, something that might connect to Mr. Travers. You might look into his cottage, Inspector. Old manuscripts, or perhaps other things." Craddock, trusting her instincts, promised to search Leonard's home. Miss Marple hung up, her mind alight with the image of Leonard by the window, his calm a stark contrast to the chaos of Evelyn's death. The motive was unraveling, but the pattern was not yet complete. Clara's investments, Travers's secrets, and Mary's absence wove into the tapestry, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, would trace each thread to its source. Chapter 10. The Yas. Confrontation. The late afternoon sky over St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of gray and gold, the clouds parting briefly to let sunlight spill across Meadowbrook Manor's manicured lawns. Miss Jane Marple sat in Clara Henshaw's drawing room, her knitting bag at her side, her demeanor as serene as the village itself. The air held a faint chill, and the fire in the grate crackled, casting flickering shadows across the gilt-framed mirrors and polished furniture. Clara had invited the remaining book club members, Julian Travers and Leonard Price, for what she called a moment of closure, though Miss Marple suspected the widow's motives were as much about easing her own unease as fostering reconciliation. Inspector Craddock had agreed to attend, his presence a quiet reminder of the ongoing investigation into Evelyn Carter's murder. Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, saw this gathering as the stage for a revelation, where the threads of motive, opportunity, and evidence might finally weave into truth. Clara, dressed in a somber navy gown, greeted her guests with a strained smile, her hands fluttering as she offered sherry and biscuits. Travers, his wiry frame taut with nerves, accepted a glass, but stood near the window, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting an ambush. Leonard, by contrast, was composed, his dark hair neatly combed, his suit less shabby than before, as if he had taken pains to appear untroubled. Miss Marple, settling into a plush armchair, drew out her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the room's tension. Craddock, standing by the fireplace, his notebook tucked away, observed the group with a calm intensity, his trust in Miss Marple's instincts unspoken but evident. Clara began, her voice tremulous. "I thought we should gather just to put this dreadful business behind us, if we can. Poor Evelyn's death has left us all shaken." Her eyes glistened, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted her handkerchief, a gesture of genuine distress or practiced performance. Travers nodded, his voice low. "It's been a nightmare. I still can't believe it happened." Leonard, seated across from him, said nothing, but his lips curved faintly, a shadow of disdain that Miss Marple caught and filed away. She thought of a village council meeting years ago, where hidden grudges had surfaced under polite words, and sensed a similar undercurrent here. Craddock cleared his throat, his tone measured. "I appreciate you all coming. The investigation is progressing, and we've had a development." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. A sugar cube, found in the library, tested positive for cyanide. It seems Miss Carter's habit of taking one cube with her tea was known to someone here. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Travers's glass trembled, spilling a drop of sherry. Leonard's expression remained impassive, but Miss Marple saw his fingers tighten briefly on the arm of his chair. "That's monstrous," Clara whispered. "Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind alight with the cube's significance, a deliberate act tailored to Evelyn's routine. She spoke, her voice gentle but clear. "It's curious, isn't it, how specific the method was. Miss Carter's preference for sugar was no secret, I suppose, but it required planning. Someone knew exactly what she would do." Her eyes, bright and searching, moved from Clara to Travers to Leonard. Clara shook her head, her voice rising. "I filled the sugar bowl myself, but I never—" Oh, it's too horrible. Travers, his face pale, stammered, I didn't touch the sugar. I poured my own tea, nothing more. Leonard, his voice cool, said, I was by the window, as I told the inspector. Far from the tray. His calm was a stark contrast to the other's agitation, and Miss Marple thought of a village poacher whose steady gaze had masked a calculated theft. Craddock nodded, his tone even. We've also spoken to Mary, the maid. She confirmed Mr. Price arrived early that evening, helping with the chairs and lingering near the tea tray before the others arrived. Leonard's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent, his composure unbroken. Miss Marple, setting her knitting aside, leaned forward slightly. Mr. Price, she said, her voice as mild as a summer breeze, you mentioned Miss Carter approached you about Mr. Travers' work. She believed the shadowed veil echoed your old manuscript, didn't she? The room stilled, and Clara's breath caught. Travers' head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. Leonard's jaw tightened, but he nodded. She did. Said she'd found evidence, details in Travers' book that matched my unpublished work. She wanted to expose him. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of anger in his eyes, like a spark in dry tinder. She continued, her tone unchanged. And you refused her offer to collaborate, out of pride. But such a revelation would have revived your career, wouldn't it? Or perhaps settled an old score. Travers, his voice rising, interrupted. That's absurd. My work is original. Leonard's just bitter. He's always been. Leonard's lips curled, but he said nothing, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, like a coiled spring. She turned to Craddock, her expression serene. Inspector, you mentioned a search of Mr. Price's cottage, I believe? Craddock nodded, producing a small evidence bag from his pocket. We found this, an old chemistry set, tucked away in a cupboard. It contained traces of cyanide, likely from a photography kit. Clara gasped, and Travers backed toward the window, his face ashen. Leonard's calm cracked, his hands clenching into fists. That proves nothing, he said, his voice low but sharp. I haven't touched that set in years. Miss Marple's eyes met his, her gaze steady. But you knew Miss Carter's habits, didn't you? And you were near the sugar bowl before the others arrived. The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple laid out her deductions. The sugar cube, laced with cyanide, was placed in the bowl for Miss Carter alone. Mr. Price, you arrived early with ample time to tamper with it. You knew Evelyn's threat to expose Mr. Travers's plagiarism, a truth that could have restored your name, but also reopened old wounds. Her death silenced that threat and cast suspicion on Mr. Travers, didn't it? Leonard's face darkened, his eyes burning with defiance, but he remained silent, his control fraying at the edges. Clara, trembling, whispered, Leonard, is it true? Travers, his voice hoarse, added, You've hated me for years. Did you do this to ruin me? Leonard's composure snapped, his voice rising. Ruin you? You ruined me, Travers. Your precious book was built on my work, and Evelyn knew it. His words hung in the air, a confession of motive, if not of murder, and Miss Marple's needles lay still, her mind clear as she saw the pattern complete. The confrontation had laid bare the truth, but Leonard's final admission, she knew, would come only under pressure, or proof. Chapter 11. The Confession. The drawing room at Meadowbrook Manor was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire and the distant chime of a clock striking 6. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair, her knitting needles still, her calm gaze fixed on Leonard Price, whose outburst had left the air charged with accusation. Clara Henshaw, her face pale, clutched her handkerchief, her eyes darting between Leonard and Julian Travers, who stood rigid by the window, his hands trembling. Inspector Craddock, by the fireplace, held the evidence bag containing the old chemistry set, his expression stern but expectant. The sugar cube, laced with cyanide, and Leonard's raw admission of his grudge against Travers had brought the mystery to a precipice. Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, knew the moment had come to nudge the truth into the open, as gently and inexorably as a gardener coaxing a root from the soil. Leonard's face was a mask of defiance, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of desperation, like a cornered animal weighing its options. Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but piercing. "Mr. Price, you've carried a heavy burden, haven't you? All those years, knowing Mr. Travers had taken something of yours, your ideas, your future. And then Miss Carter came to you, offering a chance to set things right." Leonard's jaw clenched, but he said nothing, his hands still fisted at his sides. Clara, her voice trembling, whispered, "Leonard, please, tell us it isn't true." Travers, his voice hoarse, added, "You can't pin this on me. I didn't touch her tea." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unwavering, remained on Leonard. "Miss Carter's discovery was dangerous, wasn't it?" she continued, her tone as gentle as if discussing a village fete. "She found evidence that the shadowed veil echoed your unpublished manuscript, details only you could have known. Her review, if published, would have exposed Mr. Travers, perhaps revived your career. But pride, or perhaps something darker, led you to refuse her offer. Instead, you chose another path." She paused, letting the words settle, her mind recalling a village carpenter who, wronged by a neighbor, had waited years for revenge, his silence masking a meticulous plan. Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. "Mr. Price, the chemistry set in your cottage contained cyanide traces, and you were seen near the tea tray before the others arrived. Mrs. Henshaw confirmed you helped with the chairs, giving you ample time to tamper with the sugar bowl. Miss Carter's habit of taking one sugar cube was well known to you, wasn't it?" Leonard's composure cracked, his shoulders sagging slightly, but he shook his head. "You've no proof," he said, his voice low but defiant. "That chemistry set is ancient, could have been contaminated years ago. I didn't touch the sugar." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "But you knew her habits, Mr. Price. You told me yourself. She mentioned her preference for sugar, her only indulgence. And you were there early, alone with the tray. A single cube, laced with cyanide, placed where only Miss Carter would take it. It was clever, wasn't it? Not only to silence her, but to cast suspicion on Mr. Travers, whose career would suffer from her review." Leonard's eyes flashed, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might deny it further, but his face crumpled, the defiance draining away like water from a broken dam. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room stilled, Clara's breath catching, Travers's eyes widening. Leonard sank into his chair, his hands covering his face. "Evelyn came to me weeks ago, said she'd found proof, letters, notes, that Travers had used my manuscript. She wanted to ruin him, and I wanted that too. But I couldn't let her drag me into it, make me a spectacle again. I told her to go ahead, but then I thought, what if she failed? What if Travers wriggled out of it like before? His voice broke, and Miss Marple's heart stirred with pity, though her mind remained clear. Leonard continued, his words tumbling out. I had that old chemistry set, kept it from my university days when I dabbled in photography. Cyanide was there, just a pinch, enough to make sure she wouldn't talk. I slipped a cube into the bowl, one I'd prepared, knowing she'd take it. I thought it would look like an accident, or point to Travers. He deserved it, after what he did to me. His eyes, now glistening, met Travers, who looked away. His face a mix of guilt and horror. Clara, tears streaming, whispered, "Oh, Leonard, how could you?" Miss Marple's needles lay idle, her gaze steady. She thought of a village girl who had poisoned a rival's tea over a stolen bow, her regret genuine, but too late. "You wanted justice," she said softly, "but it turned to vengeance, didn't it? And poor Miss Carter paid the price." Leonard nodded, his voice choked. "I didn't hate her. She was just in the way. I wanted Travers to suffer, to lose everything, like I did." Travers, his voice shaking, said, "I never meant to ruin you, Leonard. I borrowed ideas, yes, but it wasn't theft, not like that." His admission, though weak, hung heavy, and Miss Marple noted Clara's shocked expression, her investment in Travers now tainted by truth. Craddock stepped forward, his tone authoritative. "Leonard Price, you're under arrest for the murder of Evelyn Carter." He signaled to Constable Jenkins, who had entered quietly, and Leonard rose, his shoulders slumped, his fight gone. As he was led away, he looked back at Miss Marple, his eyes holding a mix of resignation and relief. "You saw through me," he said quietly. "I thought I'd been careful." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. "People are never as careful as they think, Mr. Price. The truth has a way of showing itself." As the door closed behind Leonard, Clara collapsed into a chair, sobbing softly. Travers, still by the window, stared at the floor, his career's shadow now darker than his novel's title. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her mind already turning to the aftermath. Leonard's confession had tied the threads of motive and method, but the pattern of human frailty, pride, envy, betrayal, remained as familiar to her as the village lanes. She rose, her movements spry, and thanked Clara for her hospitality. The confrontation had ended, but the echoes of the crime, she knew, would linger in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The soft light of evening settled over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a gentle glow as Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage parlor, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. Outside, the chrysanthemums stood resolute in the autumn chill, their colors a quiet defiance against the fading day. The events at Meadowbrook Manor had reached their climax with Leonard Price's confession, his bitter grudge against Julian Travers revealed as the spark that ignited Evelyn Carter's murder. The cyanide-laced sugar cube, the stolen manuscript, and the tangled motives of pride and revenge had woven a pattern Miss Marple had unraveled with her patient, piercing insight. Yet, as she sat by her fire, her diary closed for now, she reflected on the human frailties that lingered beyond the crime's resolution. Inspector Craddock had telephoned earlier, his voice tinged with gratitude and a touch of awe. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said. "Price is in custody, and the evidence is solid. The sugar cube, the chemistry set, his own words. We're searching his cottage for the manuscript he claimed Travers stole to tie up any loose ends." Miss Marple had murmured her usual demurral, insisting she was only an old woman who noticed small things, but her mind was already sifting through the aftermath. Leonard's arrest had closed the case, but the ripples of his actions would touch Clara, Travers, and even the quiet village itself. Clara Henshaw, Miss Marple learned from a chance encounter with Miss Hartnell at the post office, had retreated into a state of nervous seclusion. "She's beside herself," Miss Hartnell confided, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of gossip. "Says she'll never host another book club, not after this. And all that money she put into Travers' books, wasted, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her thoughts elsewhere. Clara's distress, she suspected, stemmed not only from the murder, but from her own naivety in bringing Leonard and Travers together, hoping to mend old wounds. She recalled a village matron who had once orchestrated a reconciliation between feuding sisters, only to spark a greater quarrel. Clara's good intentions, like those, had been a catalyst for tragedy. Julian Travers, meanwhile, had left the Blue Boar for London, his departure noted by the innkeeper with a shake of his head. "Looked like a man running from ghosts," he'd told Miss Marple over tea at the village shop. Travers' admission of borrowing Leonard's ideas, though not criminal, had tarnished his reputation, and Evelyn's unpublished review, recovered from her notebook, hinted at further revelations that might have ended his career. Miss Marple thought of a village poet, once lauded, whose borrowed verses had led to quiet disgrace. Travers, she mused, would write again, but the shadow of his ethics would linger, a burden heavier than any critic's pen. Mary, the maid, had been cleared by Craddock's inquiries, her trembling hands attributed to shock rather than guilt. "Just a nervous girl," Craddock had said, "no connection to the poison." Miss Marple, recalling Mary's quiet efficiency, felt a pang of relief. She thought of a village lass who had once been wrongly accused of theft, her innocence proven only by careful observation. Mary, she hoped, would find steadier ground away from the manor's shadows. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind drifting to Leonard Price. His confession had been a release, his bitterness laid bare like an open wound. She pitied him, as she had pitied others in Saint. Mary Mead, who let envy twist their talents into ruin. A young gardener years ago had sabotaged a rival's roses, his regret coming too late to undo the harm. Leonard's crime, born of a stolen future, was a darker echo of that same human failing. His arrest, she knew, would quiet the village's whispers, but the story of the book club would linger in its lore, a cautionary tale of pride and retribution. The book club itself was no more, its members scattered, its purpose undone by death. The shadowed veil, once the center of lively debate, now gathered dust, its pages tainted by the real tragedy it had unwittingly framed. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, reflected on the irony. A mystery novel had sparked a mystery far more intricate, its clues not in cryptic letters or hidden passages, but in the glances, grudges, and habits of those who read it. She thought of her niece Joan, who teased her for seeing plots in everyday life. "You're right, my dear," she murmured to herself, "but life is the greatest plot of all." As the clock struck 7, Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains, the village now cloaked in twilight. St. Mary Mead would return to its gentle rhythm, tea parties, church bazaars, the soft hum of gossip. But she knew its peace was fragile, a veneer over the secrets that stirred beneath. She tucked her knitting away, her diary resting on the table, its pages a map of human nature as much as of crime. The resolution had come, as it always did, not with fanfare, but with quiet clarity. And Miss Marple, with her unassuming wisdom, was content to let the village settle, ready for the next thread of mystery that might cross her path.